make sure they look at Josh.
He was cornered.
Hi, Susan. We haven't seen or heard from you. You said something tragic has happened.
Hey everybody, I'm Dave Cawley. I am the investigative reporter who hosts the Cold podcast. I'm here with my colleague, Becky Bruce, and we're going to be taking your questions for the next little bit. So if you have questions about anything you've heard in the podcast so far, be sure to hit us up. But Becky, you had some questions to start out?
Yeah, I do. First of all, and I think we get this one a lot, but I don't think we've ever addressed it in Facebook Q&A forms, so I thought maybe this was a good chance to break it out, which is, did Josh's mom cooperate with the investigation, and have you interviewed her?
Oh, sure. So Josh's mom, Teresa, has declined media interviews from the very outset of this case. I did reach out to her because I had some files that came off of Josh's computer that I believed she might be interested in having for herself. At the time, she expressed a desire not to be interviewed, and we respect that. Certainly, her perspective comes into the story based on court records that we have from her divorce and things of that nature. But when somebody tells us, they don't want to take part, we don't badger them. We don't, try to convince someone to do something they don't want to do. So, yes, we've been in contact with Terry, but no, she's not been interviewed.
Okay. Past couple of episodes have really focused on the actual searches in the West Desert, particularly information about mine searches, which I think a lot of people were surprised to find out were happening a lot sooner than most of us realized in the public. What was that like, kind of tracking down that information? Yeah,
I was surprised too. I don't know about you, but I remember when all this was going down, there was a lot of rumor that, she's in a mine someplace and the police are out there searching mines, but they didn't do that public, like they weren't talking publicly about that effort. And it wasn't until we got our hands on the case files and started looking through the pictures, some of the maps and things showing the places that they had gone and the dates that they had gone out to do these searches, that it started to become clear that the full story hadn't really been told as of yet. So I was surprised just at the scope and scale of the job that they did, the number of specific times that these detectives went out. They didn't just go kick the dirt around outside the mines. I mean, they took some high-powered spotlights. In some cases, they went into the mines where they were safe to do so. They used this camera that was on a 1,000-foot cable where they could drop down and visually inspect the mines with lights. And their conclusion after doing this for more than a year was essentially that they had covered all of the likely places that they considered that Josh might have put Susan in a mine, and then the investigation kind of shifted a different direction.
The rental car, 800 plus miles, 18 hours, we don't know where Josh was. What's your personal theory?
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time looking at maps. I mean, I'll sit there on Google and I'll draw out, routes that would fit that. I've come up with one that I think is pretty plausible, but the problem is without factual information, I don't like just going off of my gut or off of speculation. I would love to find something that was a little more concrete that would point us in a direction to say, Josh went here, Josh went there. We know on his way back from wherever he was, he came through Tremonton, which would suggest somewhere up north. If you consider that Josh drove that I-84 corridor back and forth between, Seattle and Salt Lake many times throughout the course of his, life living in Utah, it's certainly reasonable to conclude that he was somewhere up that direction, but 800 miles will really only take you to about the Idaho-Oregon state line. So the question then becomes, okay, what would have brought him up there if that's where he was, and could that be a place where Susan was left? And unfortunately, we just don't have enough factual information. I tend to think that was probably where he was somewhere up, Twin Falls, Boise, Ontario, somewhere in that area.
What about Alina Powell? We have a listener saying that in episode 8 in particular, she sounds almost hostile in the recording.
Yeah, I've not had a chance to speak with Alina, and haven't had a chance to even find out contact information. I don't know if she's aware of the podcast at all. I don't know if she cares. If she is, I would certainly like the opportunity to get her side. I will tell you that from some of the information that I have seen in Steve's journals, from listening to that wire recording and some of Steve Powell's videos in which she is seen or heard, my personal sense is that she was very supportive of her father, and many of the ideas that Steve Powell expressed, Alina pretty well fell in line behind him. I don't hear that there was much concern, especially in that wire recording, for Susan. It was more about defending Josh.
Sure. Another sibling, John, is he still alive? Have police asked him about what Charlie said? Would they ask him?
Right. So that what Charlie said is, excuse me, of course, in Charlie's second interview, which happened in March of 2010 up in Washington State, he made a statement that John knows where Mommy is or where Susan is. It's a bit problematic. John Powell, as we know, has had some mental health issues throughout his life. Steve's journals talk about there were times when John was institutionalized, and because of those concerns, he's not somebody who police ever focused on. I'm not aware that there was ever a formal interview between detectives and John Powell. And much the same as Alina, after this case kind of disappeared, as far as I'm aware, he kind of fell off the radar, so I've not had a chance to speak with him either.
Could Josh have met with Michael during the trip?
That is very possible. Based on the information that we know, Josh and Michael had a relationship where they communicated a lot. There are some questionable things that Michael did about a week later with his own vehicle in Oregon, which is part of what led the investigation there in 2011, 2012. And we're going to get into a lot of that, but yeah, that's plausible.
I actually had a different person asking about Michael's car and Oregon. Are we going to go there? So that sort of answers that question.
Yeah.
How far away are we from that conversation?
It'll be a bit, because chronologically that doesn't happen until later 2011 when the police become aware of that car. I've traveled up there myself on a couple of different occasions through that area. Specifically, we will have some new previously undisclosed information to share in a few weeks.
Most common question we get, how many episodes?
I knew that was coming.
You knew it was coming.
We don't know. It's still an open question simply because, and this isn't just, marketing talk, like you and I both, there is a team that is supporting what we're doing with the podcast. And as we're putting information out there, we are continuing to generate new tips. People are coming forward to share information. In some cases, it's leading us to pause what we're working on for a particular episode so that we can trace down information like the piece in episode 6 about Josh having the shoulder injury that was previously unknown. So as that information develops, we don't want to commit ourselves to say it's going to be X number of episodes and then realize now we have to try to cram everything in because we've learned new things. What I've been telling people is I feel pretty comfortable that there is a lot of story left to tell, and we're not close to the finish line yet.
We have another listener asking why you haven't yet talked about the encrypted messages between Michael and Josh. I think you were just hinting at it a little bit.
Yeah, and again, part of it is because I don't want to jump too far ahead of what the investigators knew, because I think it's important sometimes to let the listener understand when law enforcement learned about some of these things in the context of where the investigation was. There are indications that Josh and Michael were using encrypted VoIP telephone line stuff as far back as the day of Susan's disappearance. But it's challenging to put some of that information out there without sourcing it appropriately which I can't do until we understand where the investigation was at the time, if that makes sense. That's kind of an obtuse answer, sorry.
It's okay. Would you consider contacting a psychic?
Would I personally? No. You know, there are a lot of psychics who have contributed tips to the police department, and I know that a lot of the friends have been in contact with those folks. Not casting any judgment on anybody's feelings about the case or any sense that anyone, you know, might feel an impression about it, but the way I approach an investigation is based on finding facts that can be definitively proven, and a psychic impression is not something that I can take and hold up and say this is an element of fact for my story. So you know, folks who feel that way, who want to contribute, certainly share, but that's not how I approach telling the story.
Are you going to cover Josh's psych evaluation?
Absolutely. Yeah, in fact, the very first interview that I ever did for this podcast was talking to Dr. James Manley up in Washington State, and we had a pretty good conversation about that psychological evaluation and some of the things that came out of that that helped really inform how I looked at some of Josh's early, you know, childhood writings, because some of what James Manley observed, I think you can trace back to Josh's early childhood.
And that goes back to some of the early episodes of the podcast where we were not necessarily trying to paint a troubled childhood, but just trying to introduce the listener to who Josh was and what it was like to grow up Josh Powell.
Yeah,
in a sense.
Understanding who Josh was as a human being, I think, is very important. Josh, we know, ended his life and his son's life in a very horrific way, and he treated Susan very unkindly for a long time. But when I look back and see the environment in which he was raised, it's hard not to appreciate that he kind of was playing against a stacked deck in a way. And certainly if he had certain underlying issues mentally or emotionally, that some of his peculiarities, I guess is what I'm trying to say, were allowed to flourish because of, you know, being around his dad and things like that. It's important to understand that, to see how he later acted after Susan's disappearance, because you can't understand that relationship between Josh and Steve without going back in time and seeing kind of how that all came about.
Well, and now we're talking nature versus nurture. Right. Obviously, Jennifer grew up in the same family.
Yeah, she did. And there was a very conscious decision on Jennifer's part to disassociate herself from the rest of the family. That was a rift that happened, you know, when when Jennifer was a teenager. And Steve actually wrote about this in some writings that have not been made public, that we obtained. And it's very clear that Steve was not happy with the choice that Jennifer made. Steve wanted to convince Jennifer to abandon her faith and to basically kind of follow him. And Jennifer told me that, you know, at one point her mom said, "Hey, look, you have a choice to make. You can be like your dad, or you can follow your faith." And that Jennifer made a conscious decision that she was not going to follow her dad. The other children, being younger, were not in an emotional or intellectual level of maturity that they were presented with quite the same crossroads as Jennifer.
She did some amazing, brave, and this is Becky the person, not Becky the journalist talking here, brave things in your most recent podcast. Hearing that audio of her going in and trying to get Josh to talk is just, as a listener, so stunning. Does she have a sense of how brave that was?
It's tough to say. I mean, you know, talking to Jennifer, sitting down, this is all very sensitive.
Sure.
Right? And obviously I know things from reading Steve's journals. Jennifer wrote a book, which I've read, where she references some of the troubling things that happened when she was growing up. And, you know, I'm not friends with Jennifer Graves. I'm just one of many reporters who has approached her over the years to talk about some of this stuff. I felt like she was willing to share with me some very personal things. And I did tell her during that interview that what she did, I believed, as a person, like I said, you know, as a reporter, to be perfectly, you know, stone-faced in an interview, it's difficult when you're sharing that kind of a moment with somebody. And so I told Jennifer that. I mean, what an amazing thing that you did. And I'm happy to say that here. You know, Jennifer did something that took a lot of courage. And I deeply respect her for doing that. Whether she recognizes the bravery in that, I don't know.
It's interesting. Another key part of this episode was the Elders Quorum president helping Josh kind of unload his truck once he got to Washington State. And there's a mention of these buckets that Josh wouldn't let anybody but family touch. Do we know what was in the buckets?
So the best indication that we have is that the majority of those buckets contained food storage, grain, rice, beans, and you can see those in the house. I think a lot of Utahns who are of the predominant religion are familiar with the idea of, you know, maintaining food storage. Most cases that's meant to be shelf stable, so it's going to be sealed, and it's not something that you can just like crack the lid on without necessarily spoiling the content. So I'm not clear as to whether or not the West Valley City Police Department, when they conducted any of their search warrants at the house, ever did crack any of those buckets. The one in question that apparently had some kind of chemical that dripped on the floor as it was being moved out of the house. Again, I'm not sure what was in there. I'm not sure.
To what extent do you think Steve had involvement in Susan's disappearance and or murder?
Practically none. That's all.
That's all you're going to say?
Yeah,
I'm sure you have a reason for that.
I do. You know, I think a lot of people, they look at Steve and they say, here's a guy who was so obsessed with Susan and acted so odd through the course of this that certainly he had to have been involved. And when I started the investigation for Cold, I tried to kind of take my own preconceived notions and set them aside. But I will tell you that as somebody who followed this case as it was happening, yeah, for a long time I thought Steve had an active hand. And one of the first conversations I ever had with Detective Ellis Maxwell, I told him that. And he looked me square in the face and he said, "No, I don't think so." And I was floored by that. Like, what? How could you not think that Steve was involved? Coming up next week in episode 9 of the podcast, you're going to hear a recording, which is one of the largest reasons why I don't think Steve had an active hand. Now,
Spoiler alert.
Yeah, it's an open question as to whether or not, you know, with Josh and Michael living in that house, he might have overheard something that would have, you know, potentially been useful to the police. But no, I don't think he was actively involved.
Interesting too. Was the novel that Steve was apparently writing in prison ever checked out or investigated?
So his writing in prison, to put it in context, so jumping ahead in the storyline a little bit, obviously, Steve goes to prison for voyeurism, and while he is in jail and prison, for a period of time, he is just writing like crazy. And what he's writing is not his autobiography, which he also wanted to write, but it was a novel taking history, so like early Joseph Smith, you know, early Mormon history, and fictionalizing bits around that. And he wrote, I'm trying to remember how many pages, but it was a lot, by hand, while he was in prison. I don't know that anyone ever considered that to be evidence. I mean, the police were aware of it because they were monitoring all of his communication from jail. where that all ended up, I don't know.
Why didn't police get the GPS tracker from the rental car is something somebody else wanted to know. I'm assuming there wasn't one.
Yeah, so I mean, we got to jump back in time to late 2009. Some of the technology, even though it's not been that long ago, has evolved quite a lot since. So yeah, I don't believe that that Ford Focus was equipped with a GPS tracker. And another question that actually has come up about GPS tracking that I think is interesting to point out is some people have asked if the police had the GPS tracker on Josh's minivan, why didn't they know that he went to the physical therapist where he was diagnosed with that shoulder injury? I don't have a perfect answer for that, but I can give you some insight based on just what I know about the technology. If you use like your cell phone to connect to GPS for Google Maps or whatever, obviously your cell phone's constantly being recharged, right? If you're using like a handheld GPS unit, it has batteries. And if you leave that on and let it track all day long, it'll burn those batteries out really fast. When the police attach a tracker to a device or something, they don't have the opportunity to go back and constantly be replacing batteries on these devices. And so what happens is these devices a lot of times aren't tracking every single second. They're updating, say, every 15 minutes, every 30 minutes, every hour maybe. And the police will build in software what they call geofences. So in the case of Josh and the minivan, the police wanted to know if he left Salt Lake County. So once he drove over the Salt Lake County line into Tooele County on his way out to Wendover, that's when they got an alert. It's not like they had a perfect breadcrumb minute to minute of every place that the minivan went.
I see. Is that still how that stuff works today? Do you know?
I mean, batteries obviously get better over time. GPS trackers get smaller, lighter, more efficient, but it's always going to be a consideration. And so what will happen is the orders that allow the police to place tracking units on vehicles and things, they're usually for a limited amount of time. They're not indefinite. And so the police will have to go retrieve those units. If they extend, they might swap it out for a fresh one, that kind of thing.
I feel like an aside is probably a good thing here about warrants and tracking people so that people don't think that this happens all the time. Having myself gone through, for example, the FBI Citizens Academy here locally, they can't just put something on your car without going through a lot of hoops to do that. So have you had a chance to look at some of the paperwork that went behind some of the electronic surveillance and the wiring up of Jennifer?
Some, not all. Yeah, and a lot of those warrants and tracking orders, when the police released their redacted case file in 2013, that's a lot of what was redacted because they don't like talking about the specifics of how they conduct those kinds of investigations because they don't like tipping off, people who are going to be under investigation about their techniques. But you are certainly correct. I mean, we have our hands on some of the paperwork that is pretty illuminating about how they went about planning those operations. If you go back to episode 5 and that 10 minutes between when Josh left the lobby of the police station and when Ellis came in with the keys to his minivan, part of the problem is the paperwork that goes into going in front of a judge and saying, we want to put a mobile tracker on someone's vehicle. You have to explain in great detail why you consider that to be necessary. And the process of drafting that warrant and getting it in front of a judge, getting it approved, then getting the device and placing it on the vehicle just takes time, right? And Josh waited with more patience than I think was typical for him for quite a while to get his van back, but ultimately it was just too long to wait.
Yeah. Do you think Alina knows what happened?
That's just speculation. Similar situation as to Steve. I mean, she lived in that house, and so she might have overheard conversations. But there's also pretty good reason to believe that Josh didn't entrust Alina with anything near the level of faith that he had in Michael. And I'll get into why ultimately in the podcast after we get a few more episodes down the road.
Did he see her as kind of a kid sister?
I'm not quite sure how he viewed her. It's more just that he was making decisions before he took his own life about how he wanted his his assets controlled, and she received a very small fraction of that.
So we had friends and family and members of the ward locally who helped Josh pack up and move, and then we had another group of people who helped him unload at the storage unit. Is there any way to know, or do you know, what happened to Susan's things between loading and packing and their arrival in Washington?
Yeah, we have a pretty good idea. At the time that Josh moved out of the house here in Utah, the people who came over to help him make that move, he told them he was keeping Susan's things close. He was keeping them, in the cab of the U-Haul. He didn't want to put them in storage. And it seemed a little disingenuous at the time, just me as an observer, right? Because you're moving out of the house, you're abandoning her neighborhood, and she's not been gone all that long. So the idea that you're going to keep her stuff close, even though you are, moving so far away, was a little odd. Rod Stevens mentioned that when he was there unloading the U-Haul into the storage unit, he didn't see anything of Susan's property there. We have photos from when the police searched Steve's house in 2011, and you don't see any of Susan's property there. We know that Josh made a couple of other trips back to Utah after he moved to Washington. On one of those trips, he went to the Sarah Circle house, packed up a lot of stuff, and after he came back to Washington on that trip, he visited a nearby landfill, and so the thought is that he probably dumped most of her stuff at that time.
One of the things that I don't think I knew at the time, and you can correct me if this was actually out there in the public eye, was the information about the landfill search that we learned in the last couple of episodes. Would they have done a landfill search in Washington as well, or just here in Utah?
So the question is, would there be evidence to find? The landfill that I just mentioned in Washington, West Valley Police were watching him. They were actually surveilling him at the time, so they knew he went there. I'm not aware that they went and searched at that time, but they did search after Josh killed himself and the boys, because he made a similar trip to the landfill before he took his own life, and dispossessed a lot of property at that time. And they did recover some of Susan's belongings at that point in 2011. In 2012.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about the landfill search from this most recent episode, the one in Utah.
Yeah.
So was that absolutely tied to the information that came out of Saratoga Springs?
Yeah. It was a really interesting storyline when I found out about this, because it was not known publicly, which is the reason why we reported it not only in the podcast but also in our news coverage on KSL, TV and KSL.com and the Deseret News, is that this was one of many viable leads that the police had at the time, and it came from we mentioned psychics earlier. This all actually originated with a psychic tip that led to a volunteer dog search, which prompted some follow-up investigation from the police department, and they were able to actually kind of put together a credible sequence of events where plausibly Josh could have had access to a couple of vacant homes in Saratoga Springs, and there was that construction dumpster that was present in the neighborhood at the time that Susan disappeared. They were able to trace the paperwork to figure out that dumpster had gone to a recycling center and then ultimately out to the Cedar Valley landfill. And with that information, their only option to verify or disprove that lead was to search the landfill. And, the pictures of that are pretty gross. And they did end up finding something in the landfill that appeared to be biological, but it was animal, not human. And I went back and actually talked to the folks who did the original volunteer dog search, and they said, well, that's validating, because they feel like, our dogs obviously did alert on something. It just wasn't, what we thought it might have been at the time.
When you were talking with the volunteer search dog folks, were they able to tell you if a cadaver dog can tell the difference between decomposing human versus decomposing something else?
Yeah, I didn't get that deep into it, and I'll admit I am not an expert when it comes to search dogs. And there's all kinds of language, technical language about Are they a cadaver dog? Are they, are they following, say, like someone's scent? So if you want to find Susan, you introduce the dog to a scent item that would have Susan's scent on it. You would name that scent Susan, and then you would tell the dog, find Susan, and the dog will go out and follow that scent. Versus, a cadaver command, the dog is searching just for decomposition. My understanding is that can be anything from bodily fluids to actually decomposing remains. As to whether or not they can discern between human and animal, that's beyond my depth of knowledge.
Another one from a listener on our Facebook Q&A here. What do you know about this upcoming search with the private group?
Yeah. So this group, the Utah Cold Case Coalition, and a private investigator, Jensen Cold Cases, started organizing on Facebook in mid-December, is my understanding. Plans for a public search in April of areas out in Utah's West Desert. They identified what they believed to be likely mines that needed to be searched at the time. I had not yet produced and released episode 7, but I knew that that was going to include a lot of information showing that in fact those mines had been searched. And so once we released episode 7 on thecoldpodcast.com, I actually put Google Maps online that showed many of these mine locations. I estimate it's only about a quarter of the mines that were searched by West Valley Police during the investigation because the data set is just incomplete. But I spent a lot of time going in by hand and converting UTM coordinates, which for people who know geo stuff will know what that is, but basically it's taking strings of numbers and converting them into latitude, longitude that I could then plug into Google and build this map, and then taking the police descriptions of those locations and putting them together is kind of a very tedious task. But I felt it was important to provide the scope of the search that the police had done during that time frame. My understanding from just following the Facebook posts from the Utah Cold Case Coalition and Jensen Cold Cases is that they've now taken that research and incorporated it into their plans. They've identified some of the mines where the West Valley City Police Department, wasn't able to conclusively clear it, to definitively say we can't say for sure that there's nothing in here, and that they are going to take a group, I believe, called Gold Rush Expeditions, who are involved in searching mines to go out and check those themselves.
Did the judge or Washington State ever apologize for not taking the kids away from Josh?
I don't know if they apologized, but there is ongoing legal action right now, still, in the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, because Susan's parents did file a wrongful death lawsuit in the state of Washington in the federal court, accusing Washington's child welfare agencies and the courts of failing to protect the boys. Basically arguing that once they took the boys away from Josh, they had a duty to protect that they failed. They were not successful at the district court level, and then they appealed it to the appeals court. That case was actually argued before the 9th Circuit just over a year ago, and a year wait is quite a long time. But there was another case dealing with some of the same issues in Washington State that the 9th Circuit wanted to see how that came out first. And so we are expecting that at any time the 9th Circuit could come back and rule on that lawsuit.
We have another question from a listener, and I'm not sure whether they mean for Susan's disappearance or if they mean for taking his own life and that of the boys. But the question was, do police believe Josh acted alone?
So when we talk about police, you have to remember these are individuals, and that many of the detectives who worked this case, they have different theories and ideas amongst themselves. The question is probably one more of level of involvement or knowledge of others in the family. I've not talked to anyone, with maybe the exception of Ellis, who seems to think that whatever the original act was that prompted Susan's disappearance, that was entirely Josh. It's tough to say. I think certainly there's a widely held belief that Josh was assisted in covering up a homicide. As to whether or not that homicide was conducted entirely by Josh himself or in cooperation is probably a matter of debate.
Was John ever questioned?
Yeah, and we kind of touched on that earlier. As far as I'm aware, he was not. Because of his mental health considerations, I'm not aware of a time that the West Valley City Police Department ever directly questioned John.
So far, every week it seems like there's been some big thing that, gasp, was really newsworthy. Do you have some big secrets and surprises to come? You don't need to tell me what they are right now, but...
Why would you ask me that? Yeah, I mean, of course. This was a case that from beginning to end was just full of surprises. And the people who lived through it, who we've gone out and talked to, describe it as feeling like they were living inside, in a movie. It's just one crazy thing after another. When I set out to research the case and find, audio journals or recordings of Steve confessing his love to Susan, or the Jennifer Graves wire recording, it was because I felt strongly that those recordings would have an ability to tell a story in a way that me just reading it to you can't. There's a power there in hearing these people in their actual voices. And so we're not done. There are other recordings that were made throughout the course of this that we either have or are continuing to strive to obtain in order to bring them into the podcast. And yes, there will be many more moments of jaw drop.
If somebody does have a tip or a lead or something they want to alert you to, how would they do that?
Yeah, certainly if there's information that you'd like to share with myself or the Cold team, you can email us at cold@ksl.com. But I would also add that this is an active case. Even though it is cold, the West Valley City Police Department does have a cold case detective who is assigned any follow-up. And if it is information that is pertinent to potentially finding Susan, if it is a matter of evidence and not just necessarily maybe some speculation or suggestion, they would be a great resource as well.
Would you ever consider putting some of those longer bits of audio and video out there on the website or somewhere else?
Potentially. It's a balancing act in my mind, because some of them need to be presented in context, and I'm thinking specifically of the recordings made by Stephen Powell. I don't want to give him an opportunity, even though he's deceased, to continue to smear Susan's name. And some of the things that he said about her and describing what he did to her, I believe strongly that releasing that material in full to the public would be harmful to Susan and her family. So, I would hesitate to do that. But some of the other recordings, certainly I think there would be room to find a venue where we can put more long-form extended stuff up for people to really dig in and hear themselves.
We hear from a lot of people who are first-time podcast listeners who've gotten onto your show.
Which is so cool.
Right? So for people who don't know how to consume a podcast, let's walk them through that a little bit.
Yeah. There are any number of ways you can get a podcast. I mean, if you are specifically listening to Cold and you don't want to deal with apps or any of that stuff, we put every episode right up on our website at thecoldpodcast.com. It's in a player in your browser. You click the play button and it will play through. The far easier thing to do is to go and subscribe so you get new episodes as they come out. For one, I use Apple's podcast app. It's built in on iOS devices. It's easy and it's free. Likewise, on Android devices, there's Google Play. There are any number of third-party podcasting apps, Spotify, Stitcher, all kinds of different ones that if you're savvy to that kind of stuff, just grab our RSS feed or look it up in the search function in that app and download to your heart's content.
Okay. What about Steve's comment about it's a good thing Josh didn't have more wives because he would have to dig more graves? Does that indicate he really did know something?
Rattlesnake Rock. It's crazy. I'm still trying to come to a full understanding of it. That reference comes from an electronic journal that Steve wrote that has not been made public before. The West Valley City Police records included some references to it, but we actually had to submit a public records request to get access to the electronic file, which included that journal entry. It wasn't part of the original case file, is what I'm trying to say. So it's not widely known. I can tell you from looking at it in context, what Steve is talking about is making jokes about the public search effort that happened in early 2010. Steve, Josh, and Michael thought it was really funny that people were going out to the desert to look for Susan. And his comment that it was that they were making jokes, along the lines of Brer Rabbit, which is, please don't go look out here or there. And he makes this reference to Rattlesnake Rock, Michael, being quoted through Steve, right? So it's being filtered a couple times here, but I don't take that to mean that Steve actually was suggesting that that Susan was buried in a grave out in the West Desert. I think he was being sarcastic and saying that's what people think, and haha, aren't they so stupid? She's actually someplace else. And of course, Steve in his own mind believes Susan's alive, but Josh and Michael, in having these conversations between themselves, appear to share some knowledge, and they're just they're taking pleasure at the idea that people are chasing a body in a place where it's likely not.
Have police looked at places called Rattlesnake Rock?
They have. I'm not sure how extensive that search was. They did conduct some work up in eastern Oregon. They went up and talked to a couple of the local sheriff's offices up there about some potential, Rattlesnake Rock places to search. I've actually been, for the last year or so, building a map of locations with rattlesnake in the place name between Utah, Nevada, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington, and evaluating, kind of the likelihood of any of these places having been somewhere that Josh or Michael might have visited. Mm-hmm. This is getting deep into the speculative weeds because we have very little factual information to point us any more directly than that. But it does seem to be a clue that is dangling unresolved that I would love to bring a little more kind of clarity to.
I would imagine there's a lot of places with rattlesnake in the name. I can think of a couple already.
Yeah, there are, certainly. And if you consider limiting your search just to places along kind of that I-84 corridor between Salt Lake and Seattle or Tacoma, you have several. If you drive north of Tremonton towards Snowville on I-84, right before you get to the Utah-Idaho state line, you cross Rattlesnake Pass, and there's a sign right on the side of the freeway. As you go through Mountain Home, Idaho, there's a place called Rattlesnake Station, which is a historic stage stop, and Rattlesnake Creek is right by there. As you get up into Oregon, there's an area right off 84 called Rattlesnake Gulch. There's Rattlesnake Ridge and Rattlesnake Lake up along the approach to Seattle. So no shortage of places, but you have to also kind of weigh all of those against what is the likelihood that any one of these would have been a place where somebody might have wanted to dispose of a body.
Right. Is it your opinion then that the odds of Susan being in one of those spots or even in a mine pretty nil?
In the West Desert, speaking about?
Mm-hmm.
Personally, yeah. I feel that it's likely that she was not there. If you look at Josh going on that camping trip with the idea that this is his alibi, why would you bring the body to the place where you're, using as your alibi? And that's the sense that I get from Alice Maxwell as well, that he believes, Josh took Susan someplace, but it wasn't to the West Desert.
Right. There was another question there, but I've already lost track of it. Give me just a second. Okay.
Should
hold
we
that
peek?
thought.
Should we peek behind the curtain and tell people?
Yeah.
There's a.
Oh, have people searched in Washington or Idaho? Have police searched in Washington or Idaho? I know Oregon, yes, right?
Yeah, Oregon certainly. Along I-84, there were a couple locations that they did search all the way into 2013 timeframe when they were still acting on some of the hot leads in this case before it went cold. Washington State, I don't know that they've done a lot of searching. Chuck Cox pointed out to me a location kind of right behind the subdivision where the Powell family home was, where he thought that Susan might have been left. It's an area of dense woods, and there's a rifle range in there. Personally, I'm skeptical of that. Idaho, I think, is largely viewed as an area that Josh just drove through. So outside of that area right along I-84, I don't know there was much in the way of searching that went on there.
Anything else that we need to add that we haven't covered today?
Get ready, because episode 9 is going to be crazy. I mean, that's it. Thank you so much for everybody who's shared their thoughts, come at us with questions. I'm loving seeing people's Instagram stories talking about it. It's really gratifying to know that so many people are connecting with Susan's story and taking away lessons from it. This is a thing that we feel very strongly that the story that is being told in this podcast has the opportunity to prompt discussion about domestic abuse, and to the degree that we can keep Susan's memory alive, that we can use her example to help other people avoid those kinds of situations, that is why we are doing what we do. So thank you.
Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.